We are picking up on land use controls. It was like literally right at the bottom of the page where we finished. So in other words, we'll start there and then we will flip over really quickly. Public versus private when we're talking about land use controls. Here's some good news for you. Land use controls is a lot about vocabulary, and it's not distant vocabulary. It's very much what we talk about in class. For example, the non-conforming use. Non-conforming use, you were grandfathered in, you were there before the zoning change. Non-conforming use is always legal, okay? So therefore, if I sell a property that is non-conforming, it will be allowed to continue to, I'll be able to convey the property in the same non-conforming use. Excuse me. The purchaser will not be able to expand the non-conforming use. Do you feel okay about non-conforming use? Okay? And have an example in your head. Remember the gas station that was there before the zoning changed to residential. Then remember illegal use. Now illegal use, look, illegal use and non-conforming use may look the same from the road, or they may look the same in an actual test question, but what happens is you have to read it so closely. Which occurred first, the zoning or the use? So in illegal use, I started using it to build a gas station in an area that's zoned residential. Well, clearly that's not going to be allowed. Illegal use can be stopped at any point in time by an injunction. Remember the word injunction. Injunction will stop an illegal use. An injunction will also stop a violation of restrictive covenants. Do you remember that from earlier? Let me give you a very simple tip to follow on this. Because we use the same word for both public and private restrictions, what's going to happen is who brings the case is what's going to be important. If you're violating, if you have an illegal use, if you're violating the zoning ordinance, have an illegal use, then it's going to be a public official that applies for the injunction. As opposed to if you violate restrictive covenants, it will be a private individual who will go to court for an injunction, okay? So keep that tidbit in mind as you're looking. Non-conforming versus illegal. Great test question. Zone amendment just means a zoning change. There is a process. You need to know that there is a process. You do not need to know the process for a zoning change. But do understand that the municipality can't just go out and start changing the zoning. That would be violating people's constitutional rights. There has to be a due process for this to occur. Not a big deal. Variance. I love variance for test purposes. It just makes such a great question. It's easy to write. A variance, listen, with a variance, you're not changing the zoning, are you? Get that in your mind. This is not spot zoning, this is not a zoning amendment, okay? In a variance, strict adherence to the zoning ordinance would cause me to not be able to use my property. So all I'm asking is, will you give me a break from strict interpretation of the zoning ordinance? Do you remember the one I did in class, where it was literally someone built 6 inches into a setback, okay? Very basic. Variance, slight deviation, made necessary by a unique hardship, and it will not change the essential characteristic. You request this case before a Board of Adjustments, and the Board of Adjustments could say yes, but the Board of Adjustments could say no, because they do not want to set a precedent. Do you understand how all those words kind of go together? Okay? And then special use permits, special exception, conditional use. For our purposes, they're going to be tested roughly the same, and basically it's going to be this. Do you remember I said in most zoning ordinances, there are a list of special uses which will benefit the zoned area? Now, for example, my single-family residential neighborhood has special exceptions which include a fire station, a police station, a schoolhouse, things like that that are clearly not single-family residential, but they benefit the zoned area. Requests for special exceptions are made before a Board of Adjustments as well, okay? And the Board of Adjustments, you are entitled to a special exception as a matter of right. You're entitled to it as a matter of right if your case is compelling. Just a little bullet point. Tougher to write a question on special uses, to be honest with you. However, think about a daycare center in a residential area. Is a daycare center residential? No. But oftentimes it's done in a residential area because it benefits people that may have that need. Overlay districts, very simple to understand. Historic overlay would be the most common. Overlay is going to be another layer of bureaucracy on top of the restrictions. It doesn't release you from anything. Think of some examples of historic overlays. color, architecture, all of these are in fact reasons. It could be everything with a historic preservation. Spot zoning, I like my definition as it is right there, so stay pretty true to that. A parcel of land has been zoned differently from everything around it. In North Carolina, it's not inherently illegal. In other states, it describes a situation where it may in fact be automatically illegal. Spot zoning is actually a different zoning though, okay? For test purposes, oftentimes people confuse variance with spot zoning. But remember, in variance, you're not changing the zone. You're still zoned like everything around you. You just got a slight deviation. Spot zoning, you're literally zoned differently from everything around you. Buffer zone, fairly obvious to ease the transition from one zoned area to another. You okay with that? Cluster zoning allows improvements to be put more closely together to allow for more green space. Bulk regulations have to do with how much of a piece of land you can use. Importantly, subdivision regulations, if you're looking for a place to put a star, it should be here, okay? Definition of a subdivision: 2 or more lots, divide the tract of land into 2 or more lots for the purpose of resale or development, okay? Subdivision is that first division, 2 or more lots for the purpose. And then, remember, when it comes to creating a subdivision, subdivision regulations, this is a public restriction. What rules do you have to follow? Ingress, egress, utilities, engineering, etc., etc. There is a process for being approved as a subdivision. It is illegal to sell lots in an unapproved subdivision. However, since 2006, you can take contracts on an unapproved subdivision as long as you have preliminary plat approved. Now let's talk about something more important. I'm guessing at the top, yes, I was correct. Subdivision street disclosures. There is just no way you're not going to be tested on this on the state side of the exam. The Real Estate Commission has been big on this concept of subdivision street disclosures. So here are your bullet points. A developer, when creating a subdivision, can create public streets or they can create private streets. Either of those is legal, okay? Private streets, you are on notice. You need to figure out, buyer, how these streets are going to be taken care of. Is it going to be by the developer, the HOA, or by you? Anything is fair. You just need to know. The trick is on public streets, though. Do you remember this? When a developer creates a subdivision plan, they plan for the streets to be public, okay, in this case. So the streets are going to be public. However, do you understand that at the time that they make that offer of dedication, DOT does not take them over until sometime way in the future? Does this sound familiar to you? Okay? Well, just because the developer makes an offer of dedication does not automatically mean that DOT has to accept it. The streets could be inferior. The streets may never be finished, in which case DOT is not going to take them over. So watch out for wording like this. An offer of dedication does not automatically mean that the streets will be taken over by DOT. You remember how that associates with the streets, okay? Also, watch out for this as well, just so you know. How do we know that the buyer was informed? The Subdivision Street Disclosure Act requires a form to be given by the developer or seller. The buyer signs acknowledging that they got the form, that they were told how the streets were to be maintained. And if you're an agent involved, you should make sure that takes place.
Do you have to have a form signed even with a voting subdivision?
No, this is, thank you, it's only on the first transfer of land to an end user consumer, okay? Just so you know, Linda, on resales, the seller actually checks a box on the Residential Property Owner Association disclosure statement. That's the way it's handled on resale. And then for an agent, it would be a material fact whether the streets are public or private on resale, okay? Anyway, you know that's going to come up. Building codes, remember what my slide said when we came through the class? We alerted you to the possibility that people get confused between building codes and zoning regulations. Remember, building codes affect structures. They are in some ways a land use control, because if I apply for a permit for a quad in a single family area, I'll never get a permit for that. But realistically, building codes are simply state codes that basically what they cover is construction codes, construction safety, whereas zoning restrictions deal with land use. Okay? Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, I don't think you need to know anything beyond what I have in writing right there. Interstate, across state lines, land sales, no house on it. Typically, sight unseen is where the problem came in, and I think I put that in your notes there. Environmental concerns, we talked about these a little bit the other day, so let's hit on this real quickly. Lead-based paint, 1978, health concerns for what's being neurological damage. The people that were interested in protecting their children under the age of 6, by extension, pregnant women of childbearing years. And in regards to lead-based paint, importantly, bless you, the three things that we can require the seller to do, the three things we can require the seller to do. Hey, if your house is built for 78, seller, you must do this. You must provide the disclosure statement. And the disclosure statement says, do you know whether you have any lead or not? Okay. You must provide the EPA pamphlet. That's part of the rule. And the seller must provide the buyer a 10-day risk assessment period. Don't fall for any question that leads you to believe that the seller has to remediate this problem. There's no part of the law that requires the seller to remediate this particular problem. You can ask, you can negotiate, but the law does not require that. And then in regards to asbestos, the health concern, of course, is lung cancer. And in regards to asbestos, it's typically not a problem if it is intact. It's more of a problem when it is what starts with the letter F? Friable, permanent, deteriorating, airborne asbestos. The EPA says there's no acceptable level of exposure to asbestos, bless you. And in regards to asbestos, there are multiple ways of dealing with it. If it's intact, I would just leave it. I would leave it. Maybe encapsulate it. Do you remember the word encapsulation and how that applies to asbestos? Or you could remove asbestos, but you're not required to remove asbestos if encapsulation will take care of the problem. Are you content with that? You should be. Okay. In regards to radon, a colorless, odorless gas, only a problem if it's in an enclosed environment because it dissipates harmlessly in open air. Does all this sound familiar to you? Okay. And of course, lung cancer is the health concern associated with radon tests. Notice how specific we are on most of these environmental concerns. What's the problem? How do we get rid of it? What's the health concern? Move on. Okay? Those are the top three. Other environmental concerns, I kind of touch on those there, but those are the biggies. Oh, down on the bottom of the page. Something that, as I was looking over this last night, I said, I don't know if this word ever came up in class. Okay? So will you highlight the word at the bottom of the class, bottom of the page, and get yourself a cheat point if it comes up at all. When you see a PERC test, actually I would usually refer to it as a PERC, P-E-R-C, because it derives from the word percolation. I want you to associate a PERC test with a test to determine whether a conventional septic system can be used. Is that what I wrote? Okay, so far so good. I'll save you a little bit of writing. That is perfect. Okay? Having said that, I don't think I added this, so let's go ahead and get it. PERC tests are recorded per the number of bedrooms. PERC tests are recorded per the number of bedrooms. In other words, you get a septic permit based on the number of bedrooms that you're allowed to build. Not the number of bathrooms. You know, septic systems dealing with your effluent, you would think it would be tied to bathrooms, but it's not. It's actually tied to bedrooms. If you wonder why, the idea is that if you have 3 bedrooms, theoretically 6 people could live there on that septic tank. So the volume is based on how much volume can 6 people use. PERC test, you're associating that with a septic system, right? Okay. And then, if we ask you a question about how do they determine the number of bedrooms, that's through the PERC test. You get a 3-bedroom PERC, you can build a how many bedroom house? 3, or 2 or 1 for that matter, but you can't build more than 3. If you are advertising agent, if you are advertising a property that is on a septic tank, and it looks like it's a 4, but it has a PERC test of 3, a permit for 3, how are you going to advertise it? As a 3. You never advertise greater than the number of bedrooms that you're permitted for. Are you content with that? I know we didn't talk about it in class, but it's just a nice, tight little package, and then you can move on. Okay? All right, speaking of moving on, flood hazard areas. FEMA. Can you buy property in a flood hazard area? Clearly you can, but if you have a loan, you're absolutely going to have what? Flood insurance. If you ever see NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, it's a national program administered through your insurance agents, okay? It's actually a government program. Clearly, you see my last line there. Flood areas are material fact. If you're selling property in a flood area, it's a material fact. I think that's pretty safe to say. Private land use restrictions, restrictive covenants. We've already said every one of those things. Are you content that we said every one of those things? All right, now we have a problem. Now we have a problem that we're entering into chapter 7. And what did I tell you a little bit earlier? I don't have some pithy thing that I can say in regards to agency. It takes me forever to say anything. So what you're going to do to study agency is my first midterm, my chapter 5, 6, 12 test, and you're going to know those questions like crazy. If any of you have the license law book that you have purchased, it wouldn't hurt you to go over that as well. And remember Appendix A. If you don't have that book, remember Appendix A. Remember all of those examples. They're fantastic, okay? So let's get started and let's see what we can knock out fairly simply. Brokerage relationships. Do you remember that words are important in this particular chapter? The word principal and client mean the same thing, but the word client and customer mean exactly the opposite. Are you okay with that? Are you okay that the word client versus customer could change a question that is this long? All right, so you have to look for that. A buyer agent is different than a seller subagent. These are the type of things we're talking about. The agent's the one appointed to act on behalf of the client. You're okay on that. Fiduciary, just a definition to you. Fiduciary means trust. You act as a fiduciary. Customer is the third party. If in fact I am a buyer's agent, the seller is the third party to me. If I am a listing agent, then the buyer is a third party to me, customer, okay? So good on that. Don't forget this as well. In talking about agency, do you remember me talking about the concept of sub-agency? When a listing is taken, who actually owns that listing?
The firm.
The firm. And do you understand how many questions that came up in this class? What happens if I take the listing, I'm in a multi-person firm, and then I die? What happens to the listing? It stays with the firm because it was always the firm's listing. All of us are in the same firm. I take the listing. What did all of you just become the minute that I took that? You all became sellers, sub-agents. You all automatically work for the seller at that point, okay? So perfect. You're right where you need to be on that. Types of agency. Get yourself a cheat point right here, okay? There are not many pithy things I can say in this chapter, but this is one. Universal unlimited power of attorney. Have I said this in this class? The word attorney in fact. Power of attorney equals attorney in fact. Please write that down if I haven't said it earlier. If you ever see the phrase attorney in fact, what that's referring to is someone that's working under a power of attorney. Okay, attorney in fact means someone working under a power of attorney.
But that can be limited.
Yeah, it can fall into any category here. Martina, attorney in fact as opposed to an attorney at law.
Okay.
That's where we're going with this comment.
I'm saying
Yeah.
power of attorney, I can be a power of attorney to do only one thing.
Could be universal or general. That's right. It could fall into either of these categories. Attorney in fact is some type of power of attorney as opposed to an attorney at law. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Now, back to these words. Universal agent is someone who's working under an unlimited power of attorney. Like you would have maybe with an aging parent, or maybe with a spouse who is overseas or something like that. Good? Not going to happen that much in real estate. I highly don't recommend it unless you're in one of those conditions. General agent, broad discretion, narrow field. This is the limited power of attorney that we were just speaking of. Limited to one specific field. Do you remember the two examples I gave you in class of a general agent? An agent working with a firm, your relationship with your firm will in fact be a general agency relationship and a property management, okay? If you understand why that's the case, you're in great shape on that. And then finally, a special agent, someone who has been authorized to perform one well-defined task. This is the way that you're going to be when you're working with buyers or sellers in a typical transaction. One thing, one well-defined task. And by the way, don't forget the limitations. Where we're talking about special agency, you cannot sign contracts for your clients. Under special agency, you cannot sign contracts for your clients. You cannot accept contracts for your clients, okay? So that's the significance of special agency. Get yourself a cheat point there. Creation of our agency, listen, let's not kid ourselves here. Obviously, what you want to focus on in regards to creation of agency is what needs to be in writing and when. What I mean by that is anytime you're working for the owner of a property, you must have your agency agreement in writing from the formation of the relationship, okay? When would this apply? Clearly a listing agreement, right? But a property management agreement too. Once you're working for the owner, that has to be in writing from the outset, from inception, from the formation of the relationship, whatever verbiage we use on that. But then remember the rules about buyer agency. When things have to be in writing. When does the buyer agency agreement have to be in writing? No later than the offer to purchase. No later than you demand exclusivity. Obviously, if you demand exclusivity. Does a buyer agency agreement have to be in writing before you show a property? No, it does not. It has to be in writing before you write an offer. Now listen, this is not me recommending that it's not in writing. This is me saying that it's an option. Okay? Let me tell you a couple of things that I've seen come up lately that have boggled your mind. If they still boggle your mind, then just hope they don't come up. Okay? One of them I mentioned the other day in class, and it went kind of like this. When are agency disclosures in writing? Listen closely to that word again. When are agency disclosures in writing? Do you remember what my answer was? First, substantial contact. And the reason is, what is the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure? Is it a disclosure? It's a disclosure. Is the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure in writing? Yes, it is. So does it make sense that the disclosure is in writing at first substantial contact? I didn't say the agency agreement. That would be a jerky thing to ask, but understand what I'm looking for there. The disclosures, yeah, they were in writing at the time of first substantial contact, because that's what the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure is. Your agency agreements would follow the rules we previously talked about, okay? And then there's another one that came up that's a little bit of a long shot that I kept noticing it pop up in little databases, because we have to ask you a bunch of questions in the databases. I don't know that I ever actually said this in class, and I apologize. When a buyer agent talks to a seller's agent, they must disclose their agency status at initial contact. It's the only time you'll ever see initial contact come up. I don't want to do this today, but I want to tell you a very quick story, because if you know the story, you're probably okay on it. The reason this exists is, you remember that buyer agency did not even exist until the early 1990s. Remember that? Okay? So what happened is when buyer agency came into existence, the Real Estate Commission felt like it would be fair for you to tell the listing agent, say, hey, listen, I work for the buyer. Because up to that point, everybody worked for the seller, right? So Dennis theoretically could have told me anything he wanted to, and I couldn't have disclosed it. But as of the early 1990s, now all of a sudden, I work for I can be a buyer's agent. So the commission thought, you know what, Chris, buyer's agent, the first time you talk to that seller's agent, just go ahead and tell them. Just go ahead and tell them that you work for the buyer. That's why the rule became initial contact. Now, I apologize for not spending more time on it, but today it almost happens by happenstance, so I don't even think that much about it, okay? That's the only time initial contact will come up. I'll put it that way. If it boggles your mind, don't worry about it. It's not likely to come up. First substantial contact, you know my definition of first substantial contact. This looks important down at the bottom. Agency notes to know. What does this mean? Agency agreements are employment contracts, therefore describe the rights and duties of the parties. Importantly, look what I have underlined. Have you heard me say this before? The test often tests you on when you earn your compensation. Rarely does it test you on when you're going to get paid. Okay? You understand what I mean? I earn my compensation when I brought a ready, willing, and able buyer to the terms of the contract. I got paid at closing. Okay? You're shaking your head, yes, I feel good about that. Continuing. Note words like subagent of seller working with the buyer. I hate words like this because I know what you're thinking, and it's past time for you to be thinking this. Who in their right mind would do this? It doesn't matter. It's just a test, okay? Buyers can choose not to be represented. Subagent working with the buyer. This agent has no agency with the buyer and owes fiduciary duties to the seller. Remember the effect on communication as well. Not only that, but you remember how I tried to trick you when we were talking about communication on this, and I mentioned this. You are working as a seller sub-agent because the question said so. Not because it made sense, because the question said so. You're working as a seller sub-agent, and now you ask me, can I write up an offer for you? Do I have to reduce buyer agency to writing before I write an offer? No, because I'm not a what? I'm not a buyer's agent. So I don't have to reduce it to writing. And if you want to go ahead and go for the gold on this one, do you remember where it is, where it has been memorialized, that you know that I'm working for the seller? The Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, down at the bottom of the tear-off page, disclosure of seller sub-agency, I had you acknowledge it here because I wanted in writing somewhere that you understand that I work for the seller. It's so unusual. Okay? Excellent. And then dual agency is legal with the informed consent of the parties. Dual agency, when does it need to be in writing? Look, guys, I hate to do this to you, but do you remember in class, we talked about the idea of, is oral dual agency ever an option?
Yes.
Yes, but it can only grow out of what? Oral buyer agency. Now, if you're nodding your heads, you're saying yes right now, I'm going to find out in about 2 days whether you are going to be true to that or not. There was a great example, I can't remember what page number it was in your book, but there was a great example in gray where they went over a question dealing with this. And then Martina even asked me a question about it earlier today. A question started out an exclusive buyer agency agreement, which ultimately went to dual agency. Is there any way that's ever going to be oral buyer agency? No, because it started off as a what? Exclusive buyer agency. It's one of those type things that once you just say, you know what, it's a rule, and I'm going to follow it, you ultimately have a chance of getting it right. If you try to fake it, you're not going to get it right. Designated agency as well. Designated agency as well. A type of question that they ask in regards to designated agency is, does everybody understand that designated agency is a type of dual agency? You can't get there unless the circumstances of dual agency exist, right? Okay. So anyway, now that designated agency is an option, what happens if I am a provisional broker designated for the buyer and you are my broker in charge designated for the seller? PB buyer? Big seller? Can that be designated agency?
No.
You are all correctly saying no, but let me ask you this, can that be dual agency?
Yes.
That can. And that's the point of some of these questions. Just because designated agency is not allowed doesn't mean you can't be dual agency, okay? Karen? Okay, good. That's a toughie right there. If you understood what I was saying, you're in great shape on that. Do you also remember the 2 rules of designated agency? A PB cannot be designated for one party if their bid is designated for the other. Okay? And then I can't be designated for one party if I have prior confidential information about the other party. Okay? Material facts. Look, the best way, I'm sorry, Raj, go ahead.
So, you said that between the big and the provisional broker, there can be dual agency?
Correct.
But the people know the...
But he can't do anything with that information. Because remember, in dual agency, everybody stays neutral. And that's why it's allowed. Whereas in designated, technically, you can take a side and use that information. Okay, I know it seems strange, but that's the logic behind it.
So let me get this straight. Dual is neutral. Once you go designated, you go back to the ad.
That's clearly said. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect.
Could you repeat that?
I can't remember how he said it, but what he said was, I was just playing along. I don't know if what he said was correct. In dual agency, what he said was, in dual agency, what was the word? Everybody's neutral. Everybody's neutral in dual agency. But if designated agency is allowed, then you can actually advocate for the party for which you were designated. Okay? Very succinctly and perfectly said. Okay, Dennis, don't say anything else today.
You're 100%.
100% right now. Material facts. Now, in regards to material facts, obviously this is huge for the exam. Willful misrepresentations, willful omissions, negligent misrepresentations, negligent omissions. But you have a playbook for this. Not only my midterms, but also the examples in Appendix A. You hit them, you understand them, don't fight with them, okay? Make sure you understand what they're trying to accomplish, and that is as strong as you can get on these material facts. Material facts are a lot of fun to talk about during class. You do understand on the test. We can't go gray. I know it has to be pretty much black and white on that. You'll probably do better on that than you think you're going to do. Listen, I'm not saying don't study. Just because I'm not spending a lot of time on it right now, I'm imputing this to you. You're going to study it. Midterm exam and Appendix A examples. Okay? Here's another simple point for you. Look at it just below, middle of the page. Duties to principals and duties to third parties. What do I owe to my clients? Well, I went back to using loads here, but in your notes you probably have old car. So either loads or old car. But keep in mind, to my client, I owe loyalty. Do I owe loyalty to a third party? No. I can't cheat a third party, but I'm not loyal to it. And I don't have to obey a third party. So literally these lists right here could get you a cheat point on the exam. To a third party, honesty, fairness, competency, and material facts, but clearly not loyalty. Okay?
I like the comparison, working with and working for.
Yeah, literally in this chapter, remember words have specific meanings. I work for a client. That guy I can work with, I ain't gonna cheat him, but he's not my guy. Okay, good. Liabilities for breach of duty. Let's see, what's the commission going to do to you? Reprimand, censure, suspend, revoke. They cannot fine you. What can the courts do? Let's see. Highlight this real quickly. Highlight this. Violations of license law are a class 1 misdemeanor. That's one of those factoids that if it does come up, it's right near the bottom of the page where it says courts. Yeah. And here's the point I'm trying to make. If you violate, as agents, if you violate the rules of license law, you automatically are violating the license law. If you violate the rule, you're automatically violating the law. And that could be a class 1 misdemeanor, punishable by fine or imprisonment. Not by the commission, but by the court system. And then remember, I said this many times, the courts can't take your license. Just like the commission can't fine you, courts can't take your license. So just remember who can do. Obviously, the bottom of civil liability, anybody can sue you. So there could be civil liability. Let's see, residential property disclosure statement. Here's good news and good news. The good news on the residential property disclosure statement is you're going to get tested on it. Okay, there's just no way you're not going to get tested on the state side on the residential property disclosure statement. Why the state side? Because it's a state law. Residential Property Owners Association disclosure statement. Who fills out the property disclosure statement? The sellers fill it out. You are not going to fall for any example that makes you believe that the agent completes these, okay? Now, as the agent, you're responsible for making sure that the buyer receives it and the seller does it, but you are not going to fill these forms out. And what do you think about a comment like this? The property disclosure statement requires the seller to disclose all known defects. That's not true. And the reason it's not true is because they could check what? No representation is never a lie. No representation is never a lie. Also on that note, what else did I want to tell you? Oh, regardless of what the seller checks, it doesn't affect your obligation as an agent for material facts. Okay? Do you remember the two main exceptions to the property disclosure statement? Two main exceptions to the property disclosure. New construction and foreclosure. There are several others. Lease options, you would not have to do it.